That's a great place to start, Tim, because this is one of the episodes that has really drawn a lot of attention to this conflict between, free speech and the absolutist version that Elon Musk has been promoting, especially on his Twitter platform, and some of the hate speech and disinformation that are behind, authorities say, some of the recent rioting that took place in the UK following the July 29th murder of three schoolgirls. Since that attack, there was a surge of disinformation on X, but on other platforms too, like Telegram, that sought to foment the crime and turn it into an anti-immigrant moment. And far-right groups in the UK and elsewhere really seized on it. And we saw an eruption of violence in cities across the UK for several days.
What is free speech? Because I think about it, I'm like pulling up the First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment
I do
of
not
religion
envy Michael, who has to answer this question. I'm just going to say that right now.
The free exercise thereof, or bridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. What does free speech, which is, I think, if you ask most Americans when they think about what is America, I would think free speech comes to mind, that we can kind of say whatever we want, even if it's controversial. So what is free speech?
Carol, this is a great question, and this is the ultimate tension underlying the discussion here, and that we're seeing on X and on other platforms. Really, is how do you define it, and whose speech is it? But it is also a question of, what is the speech seeking to do? There's a difference between controversial speech and even hateful speech, things that may be of a racist nature or sexist nature, but speech that tends to incite violence or harm people or cause harm. Even the U.S. Supreme Court, which has, resolutely defended the First Amendment and this idea of, virtually unfettered expression by Americans and really by others here in the U.S., and a sentiment shared by other governments and other countries, other democracies as well. One of the differences is, what about shouting fire in a crowded theater? What about crying wolf in a way that could cause stampede or could cause harm or could incite riots? And that is one of the questions really at hand in this whole discussion, that should the platforms that carry some of this communication do something to step in and say, hey, wait a minute, this could really cause some trouble, so we will not air that. In other words, exercising some judgment about what they are carrying and what appears and what gets spread out to millions of users. And this also includes the question of disinformation.
Yeah.
After a certain point, falsehoods can have an influence on public opinion and even election results.
Mm-hmm. I think, Michael, what is challenging, particularly for these technology platforms that you and Kurt write about, is what is considered free speech in Brazil might not be considered free speech in the US or the UK or perhaps India, for example. So even though these platforms are available in all of these different parts of the world, what a user sees in one of those areas might not be allowed for a user in another area, no?
Well, Tim, I'm glad you brought that up, because we have seen differing approaches in different large democracies like the US, like Brazil, like India, where governments have taken different stances. In India, in February, the government was able to pressure X to suspend several accounts that were linked to incendiary content that risked stoking these farm-related farmer protests and making them into really violent actions. And so the government was able to get the platform to back away. And in Brazil, we saw similar pressure on X from the government, from the nation's highest court, the Supreme Court, which was pushing to get some accounts suspended over the dissemination of what authorities in Brazil saw as fake news related to the country's 2022 election. That's still an issue being disputed, in fact, by Musk. Just the other night, some documents were unearthed related to the Supreme Court, and he posted them on X and pointed to it as what he saw as evidence of Brazil trying to curb free speech. Now, in the
Well,
U.S., it's a different question. And the problem in the U.S. really is that we don't really have laws that allow regulators to step in with as much vigor.
but it's hard, right? Because social media, I always think about it's media, and increasingly people get their news from social media, right? And I think about, I grew up in the world, whether you are a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal or a Washington Post, that if you put out incorrect, or an ABC or an NBC or a Bloomberg, that if you put out wrong information, you had to correct it. If you put out an opinion piece, it was very clearly an opinion piece. And so I do wonder, how are we supposed to look at social media? Should it not be policed? Yes, freedom of speech, but when there are inaccuracies, what's the responsibility of those platforms?
Well, Carol, that's another great question there about the responsibility of these platforms versus some of the old media vanguard. I came up myself through the newspaper industry before joining Bloomberg, and even at Bloomberg, we have a rigorous approach to accuracy and making sure that if we make a mistake, we correct it, that we vet our articles before publication. And on the social media platforms, there really is no vetting, there is no screening. And at X, in fact, after Elon Musk purchased it in 2022, he made a number of drastic cuts to the workforce. It's part of a cost-cutting move. But one of the areas that was especially hard hit was the section that was devoted to writing and enforcing some of the rules governing user posts. And Elon Musk really wanted, no holds barred. And he wanted users to be the ones who were the police force, sort of like a posse in the old West days.
All I would say is, I just pulled up Elon Musk on X, Twitter, whatever the heck you want to call it, but he's got 194.6 million followers. And so,
even if you don't follow him, he'll show up in your feed.
Well, and the point is,
if you do click the algorithmic feed,
followers policing, not all followers. I mean, he obviously has a lot more might on the platform, or somebody like a Donald Trump when he was on the platform has a lot more might. And so, I don't know. I don't feel like policing is so equal either. So, yeah.
That's right. A lot of people have faulted the community notes as being an inadequate tool to be able to rein in some of the what is seen as harmful content.